About a study which looked at the link between AMH and ovarian stimulation and success rates in intrauterine insemination. So in this study, they looked at 492 women who were given a dose of 75 international units of recombinant FSH. And these were women whose BMI was looked at, the AMH was looked at, and they considered an optimal response of 2 to 3 follicles more than 15 millimeter, or 4 follicles of which 2 to 3 follicles were more than 15 and 1 to follicles less than 15 millimeter. And that would be the optimal response. The suboptimal response was either a hypo response of 1 follicle more than 15 millimeter or a hyper response of 3 of more than 4 follicles, 4 or more than 4 follicles of less than 15 millimeter. Now, if we have a look at the study, and the reason why this study is important is what is the normal starting dose in an intrauterine insemination? And it is 75 international units. And the reason why we stimulate the ovaries is that there is a school of thought that believes that stimulation of the ovaries gives you a better live birth rate, and though that can be contested in different studies. Now, what did the study tell us? That what were the indicators? If you looked at the suboptimal response, 45% of women with hereditary normal AMH had a suboptimal response of 1 follicle, while 21% had a hyper response. Now, what are the factors that played a role in it? AMH did not play a role in it. And very low AMH may be indicative of a hyper response, but AMH was statistically not playing a role in the stimulation setup. In fact, the FSH and the BMI gave a better indication of hyper response. So higher the BMI and higher the FSH had a better link to a hyper response, while a lower BMI and a lower FSH gave a better link to a hyper response. Now, if you look at success rates, in the optimal response, the pregnancy rate was 15%, and in the hyper response, it was 16%. So the success rates were not very much different. In other studies too, the hyper response of 1 follicle has ranged from between 25 to 30%, and this is quite indicative. So what does the study tell you? The study tells you is that in the cases of higher BMI and a slightly higher FSH, it may be more reasonable to start somebody on 100 of FSH rather than the 75, since that may give rise to 2 or 3 follicles, which may give you a better optimal response. In the same way, if you have got a low FSH and a low BMI, that could also be indicative that you may head towards an over response, and it may make more sense in trying to lower the dose. And what does it in summary this tells you? This tells you that the BMI and FSH are better indicators in a mild stimulation intrauterine insemination cycle rather than AMH. And that is something which is quite reasonable when we think of going for an IUI cycle. Thank you.